May the Lord give you his peace. Welcome to class number 7. We're continuing to discuss the life of St. Francis, particularly his youth. In our last class, we talked about Francis's purity and how he maintained his purity throughout his youth. I mentioned how he never looked a woman in the face. It was part of the culture of his time. Now, you do that today and people think you're rude, so I wouldn't recommend doing it. But in Francis's time, it was certainly part of his cultural experience. You didn't look a woman in the face because it was a sign of lust for that person. And so, Francis abided by those rules for knights. Now, he was a cultured young man. He never did an offensive or coarse word come out of his mouth. And if anyone spoke improperly to him, he resolved not to reply. So, we see that he had a lot of virtue as a young man, particularly in the control of his tongue. St. James says the man that can control his tongue is truly a virtuous man. And Francis controlled his tongue. He didn't like listening to garbage, nor was he going to say garbage. He resolved not to reply. Now, he also avoided wounding anyone and being most courteous to all. He made himself universally loved. So he was a courteous person. He didn't want to wound anybody with his words. And so people really loved him. They really cared about him because, hey, this is a good young man. He's not saying anything nasty. He stays out of that stuff. He's kind of cultured. He's courteous. He cares about how people feel. So you see a really good human formation there in Francis' care for other people. Now, he was always sensitive to the poor. We mentioned this in the last class about how his school was his school opened up doors for the poor. And so Francis had a great love for the poor, even from his early childhood. Very sensitive to them. He was always saddened by the poor. He was always drawn to them. And he was very generous to them. One day when he was busied with selling of cloth, the beggar asked for alms for the love of God. And Francis shooed him away because he was just busy. And later he thought better of it. And he said to himself, if that poor man had come to me in the name of some baron or count, certainly I would have listened to him. How much more should I have done so, seeing that he spoke to me in the name of the King of Kings and the Master of all? And from then on, Francis vowed never to refuse anyone who asked in the name of the Lord. Now, not only do we see here a sensitivity to the poor, but we see here a sensitivity to the Lord. Now, this is before his conversion. He's still out, prince of rebels. He's out there hanging out with his friends, and he's out there doing whatever, But yet there's a sensitivity that he has to the poor and to the Lord, where he makes this resolve that if anyone ever asks him ever again in the name of the Lord, he was not going to refuse him. Now, Francis will carry this out more deeply when he becomes a friar, that if anybody asked anything of him, he would give it to them. And for him it becomes deeper because it becomes a matter of observing the gospel. If someone asks you for your cloak, give him your shirt as well. The press you to service for 1 mile, go with him 2 miles. Francis will observe that to the nth degree in a deeper way after his conversion. But here it begins with a reverence for the name of God by never refusing anything to the poor asked for in the name of the Lord. And so this shows his sensitivity to God even in his quote-unquote wild youth. Now, Francis's dream was to become a great knight. He drank in the stories of the old knights. To be a knight was like a step in the social scale for him, a step up in the social status. To go from being a merchant to a victorious knight would place Francis on the scale equal to the nobles. Like, this was a great thing socially. And Pietro Bernardone, his father, was all for it. Anything to get out of that sense of being a merchant that could be shoved back into serfdom if the feudal lords pushed too hard. Pietro and Francis wanted to rise up out of that merchant and continue being merchants, but being equal in status to the Lord so they couldn't be pressed back down into serfdom as what almost happened during their own lifetime. So chivalry was still the way to obtain glory, power, and prestige. So to become a knight, that's how you would gain the glory, the power, and the prestige. Now, Francis also only dressed in fine clothes. He had his father make for him an outfit like the French troubadours. So you see his love for both clothing and style, and also his love for music. You know, if he was alive today, I'm sure he'd probably be dressing like these, music stars, or and singing all those love songs that are out there. You know, very romantic person. You know, I guess being French and Italian, you can't help but being romantic. But Francis was very romantic, and he loved music, but he also liked to dress really fine and liked to dress after the manner of these French troubadours. You have to wonder what his friends said to him, right? You know, they see Francis walking around dressed as a French troubadour, like, Francis, what are you doing? What is this about? You know? So, I guess he had the money to do it, so he did it, you know? So Francis loved those love songs and the tales of the great kingly stories, you know? And as I mentioned earlier, he had a great love for France and a great love for the French language. His mother being French, he loved to speak French, he loved to sing in French, particularly when those French troubadours came through. Later, after his conversion, as I mentioned, he would talk about how he loved France because of the devotion he saw to the Blessed Sacrament. And during his conversion, when he's rebuilding San Damiano's, he'd hang off the scaffolding and he would sing in French, inviting people to help come and rebuild this church, which would be the home for poor virgins who would glorify God by their lives. So he had a great love, again, of France and the French language. Okay, so now, during Francis's youth, there were various prophecies about him. So some man in the city would always take off his cloak and lay it before Francis's feet, saying, "He is worthy of every reverence, because he will accomplish great things in the future, and for them he will be magnificently honored by all the world." Now, imagine that going to Francis's head. Here's this guy in the city laying his cloak before you, making this great prophecy that he's going to be honored throughout the whole world, magnificently honored throughout the whole world. Now, I'm sure Francis thought that that was going to be fulfilled as a knight, but certainly it was fulfilled only through his humility and his meekness. It was Francis's humility and his meekness that made him magnificently honored throughout the whole world and allow him to accomplish great things for the glory of God. Now, when the gossip about Francis's wild youth reached the ears of Pica, his mother, the little lady's chit-chatting around the well, Pica would say of him, she would say, "What do you think of my son? Someday he'll be a man of God." So that was another prophecy by mom, and remember, the people in the town thought that Pica could tell the future, and here she was making this prophecy about her boy. And she was right. She was definitely right. There was definitely in her heart that sense that her son was going to reach that great greatness in God and be a man of God. Now, in 1177, now we're talking 5 years before Francis's birth, Emperor Frederick Barbarossa placed as Duke over Assisi Conrad of Ursulingen. He was a cruel man and resided in the Castle La Rocca, that castle where at the top of the city of Assisi. And by this move, the feudal lords regained power over the merchants, and people were forced back into serfdom. Remember, I told you that Pietro and Francis were afraid of being forced back into serfdom. That's because in 1177, that was taking place during Pietro and his father's own time. So people were forced back into serfdom. The merchants were stripped of their rights. The lords were binding together to keep the merchants from rising in the social status. Now, by 1198, when Francis is now 15, 16 years old, the merchants rose up against Conrad, and he fled. And the Assisians stormed and destroyed the castle. Pope Innocent III ordered Conrad to surrender Assisi to him. And then Assisi formed a council government. They threw out the lords. They threw out all of these, people. And again, Claire's own family was part of that. They had to leave. The Offerduccios had to go out. They basically cleared the city of these feudal lords. They were tired of them. Just as they rebelled against Charlemagne, I guess, they were rebelling against these feudal lords. Wiped them out. Cleared them out, I should say. They didn't kill, wiped them out. And so Assisi formed a council government. Became a very democratic city. They rebuilt the castle. And, Francis would have been part of that rebellion, being the son of the wealthiest merchant. And so he would have been part of that. So Assisi wanted to rid themselves of feudal aristocracy, who continued to place tolls on the roads and make trade difficult. If you're a merchant and you got to pay tolls all the time, you're going to rebel. You want to get your stuff in and out, no cost. But here are these feudal lords putting these tolls on the roads, making it more difficult for transporting of goods. Now, the Ctesians, they burned the castles of these lords. Palaces were demolished. Owners were executed. Lords were put to death. And as I mentioned, Clara's own family had to flee to Perugia. In 1198, Assisi was emancipated. On December 9th, the first council of the city, Bonbarone, was elected. He acts as an arbiter in controversies. This Bonbarone, this good baron, as his name signifies, will later enter religious life. We're told by historians that Bonbarone, the first mayor, the first democratically elected mayor of Assisi, became a friar minor, became one of the members of the Order of St. Francis. He took the name Elia, or Elias, Brother Elias. Now, if it is truly the case that Brother Elias is Bonbarone, the first democratically elected governor, mayor of Assisi, it only makes perfect sense that Francis would have trusted him so much. We're always wondering, why did Francis trust him? Why did Francis trust Elias? Well, if it's the same person, then when Francis was 15 years old, he elected him as mayor of Assisi. Why wouldn't he trust him with the order? It only makes sense. Now, he was from among the nobles of the city. He attended the University of Bologna and possibly was married before he became a friar. In the battle, Francis fought bravely against those lords, and they said he was impulsive and not a little rash. So Francis's own behavior in battle was not perhaps the best, but kind of won a little bit of a name for himself, or reputation, we should say. Now, we're going to move on to the next part here. So we move now up to Francis being 16, and then we're moving up to his later years of 1201, where he is now 19, possibly 20 years old. Okay? In 1201, Francis is 19, 20 years old. 19 to 20 years old. Perugia declares war on Assisi. Now, Perugia, that city just north of Assisi, was aroused by Assisians nobles who fled to Perugia and then declared war on Assisi so that the feudal lords could be avenged. And so you had all these feudal lords, after that rebellion in 1198, they all flee. Now it's 3 years later, they want to go home. They want to go back to Assisi. And so living in Perugia, they want to go back and take their castle. So they declare war on Assisi. And Perugia doesn't need any excuse to take war on Assisi. Remember, they've been fighting since 250 BC. This is nothing new in the rivalry between them. So the Perugians are more than happy to help these noble lords go after Assisi and get back their lands. The war lasted for at least a decade. Before a war began, Perugia, who now had Assisi's old lords as their citizens, had to defend and protect and restore the lord's property. Perugia demanded that Assisi rebuild the castle of Sosorosa and pay damages. Assisi responded with bravado and insulting messages, typical for, fighting cities. They preferred to resort to arms. So for 2 years, the struggle was limited to raids, cavalcades, the destruction of crops, surprise actions, ambushes, battles for places on borders that were lost and won, burning of the old towers, stuff like that, kind of little skirmishes for 2 years, from 1198 to 1200, 1201. Okay? In the meantime, the citizens of both cities were preparing for a decisive blow, organizing their armies, intensifying alliances, and engaging mercenary companies. Perugia made a pact with Foligno. Aid was sent to Assisi by Nocera, Bavegna, Spello, Rosciano, and Fabriano. So Assisi really built alliances with these cities of Norcia, Bavegna, Spello, Rosciano, and Fabriano. Now, November 1202, the Great Battle of Collostrada. Collostrada, Collastrada, Collostrada. Francis fought with the company of the cavalry Those who could afford a horse and armor were different from a foot soldier. So Francis wasn't a foot soldier, he was a horse soldier, he was a cavalry. Assisi was beaten terribly. It was a massacre beyond any measure. They said the fields were covered with the dead. The cruelest slaughter that Perugia ever had taken upon any of its enemies up to that time. It was a devastating battle, and Assisi was decimated. Francis was taken captive. Later in life, Francis would say to the friars, now listen to his feelings about that war. You can see this is years later. Today they diagnose him with PTSD. But it was such a bad battle, and so many Assisi's youth were lost, and the way the Perugians treated the Assisians was horrible. And this is what Francis said about Perugia. He said to the friars, "The men of Perugia have done many evil things to their neighbors, and their hearts are lifted unto ignominy. However, the revenge of the Lord is approaching, and his hand is on his sword." So we see how Francis, really looked back at that battle as being such a horrifying experience that he even prophesies that there's going to be destruction within the walls of Perugia itself. And it came to pass that such civil strife broke out in Perugia that they killed many of their own citizens. Francis told Perugia that it would happen in that way, and it did. He told them straight out that that's what was going to happen to them when he was a friar many years later, but it happened. So in that year of 1202, Francis gets imprisoned, and they put him in with the nobles. They mistook him from the nobles because his suit of armor was so nice looking, the way he behaved. They figured this guy has to be nobility. And so he was 20 years old. His great sadness ended when Francis took responsibility for other prisoners. So he was there, he was satisfied taking care of other prisoners. And then he returned to his old dreams of glory. There he is, locked up in prison, taking care of other prisoners. He kind of shakes off the depression of despair, and he starts getting these fanciful ideas. He kept joyful and serene, revealing his courage. And some mistook his joy for insult, and some of the prisoners got a little upset with him, like, "What's wrong with you, kid?" He reconciled the prisoner who had been shunned by other prisoners, so he was again being that peacemaker. And then he fell sick and was placed with other sick prisoners. And Francis would say that he no longer had limits on his road, that he was to win the greatest liberty that the world had ever known. So there's some sort of prophetic idea that something was about to open up for him. Or maybe he was thinking of his own death, that his limits were going to end, he was going to die and move on to glory or something. But then he went on to assure them that he would be revered by all men. So again, he begins to prophesy about himself, which some took as like, "What's wrong with you, kid? Pretty arrogant. You're sitting in prison for crying out loud." But Francis, being Francis, didn't let that stop him. Now, the law of Perugia stated that the seriously ill prisoners could be released for a price. So in 1203, Pietro arranged for the release of his son. So Francis spends a full year in prison, awaiting that day his father would bail him out. He was so sick, it was better they had their father come and bail him out than have to bury this guy. So they made money off Francis getting released instead of dying in their prison. And thanks be to God, because it did save his life. So in the next class, we're going to pick up and talk about Francis after being released, his grave illness, and the beginning of his conversion experience to the Lord. May God bless you, and may it keep you.